Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. May God's peace, mercy, and blessings be with you. Today, we're going to have a talk about the philosophy of science as it applies to understanding Darwinian evolution. And today, we have Brother Suboor Ahmad, who's going to be speaking about this topic today. And he is a member of Sapiens Institute, and he is located in the UK. And with that, I can give the mic to him, and he'll start his talk then, inshallah.
All right, brilliant. Thank you so much for having me. Firstly, Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Many years ago, when I was a university student, it takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of time, takes a lot of energy and a lot of willpower to actually set up talks and get people together, do the marketing, arrange stuff. So a big thank you to everybody involved. I think you call them MSAs over there in Canada. We call them ISOCs, but it's the same thing, yeah, just a big shout out to everybody involved, all the people on the front line, on the back line. At the end of the day, without you guys, in fact, all of the great stuff that we see online, a lot of that will be limited because we depend a lot on Islamic societies to actually arrange these events. So that being said, also, I just want to thank everybody watching. This is a very important topic. I'm going to try and speed it up as much as I can for the simple reason that this talk is already something that I've delivered online many times. You're going to see this if you just put in YouTube, Islam, evolution, and Darwinism. I've tried to market myself as much as possible. Wherever there's Darwin or evolution, I try and stick my face in there and just try and plug my YouTube channel, which is Darwinian Delusions. You can join that channel. So I'm going to try and whiz through this, guys, because I want to get to the Q&A, and I think that's the real important thing. And I've always had very good interactions with the Canadians. You guys are very much in tune with the Dawah scene and the sort of questions that come across from Canadian audiences are always very interesting. So to begin off with, Islam, evolution, and Darwinism, what are we basically talking about? We are talking about Darwin's theory of evolution, where we are speaking about the modern synthesis, essentially the synthesis between genetics and Mendelian genetics and the ideas of Darwin. So the way that this is actually propagated in the world, you can see it with, somebody is waving me goodbye. So you can see this, with this sort of icon, right? You can see a transition from an ape-like creature, chimpanzee-like creature to a human being. We have this idea of progress. We have this idea of natural selection, making organisms which are faster, better, more intelligent, more robust. However, this image, the reason why I put it at the beginning of the presentation is to show that this is not the way that Darwinian evolution works. Darwinian evolution is not based upon things getting better and bigger and more intelligent. There is no inherent progress. And that sounds really counterintuitive, because when we think, you should evolve or things evolve, or the sorts of thing that we see in adverts where, things are getting better over time and we call that evolution. That's not how evolution works. That's not how Darwin's theory actually works. And if we can be wrong about this fundamental basic idea which is propagated, then imagine all the other things that we could actually be wrong about. So I'm going to be covering these topics. And by the way, guys, these are really broad, deep topics, and I'm not going to do them justice at all in this presentation. That's why I want to leave a lot of time for the Q&A. So we're going to cover the relationship between science and certainty, the current state of Darwinian evolution, a little bit about God's existence and Darwinism, why Darwinian evolution is unique, and Islam and science, just generally as a topic. So just, the people I'm going to be referring to and citing are just your standard academics, nothing. I'm not going to be taking, um, the position of intelligent design proponents, although, there is an argument to be made there. I'm just going to be referring to the standard sort of things you can get in the literature. Firstly, we need to sort out what is science. So science is not really a thing, right? It's not, you can't really say this is science or this is the scientific method. This is how we define science. When you go into the literature in terms of the philosophy of science, you see there's a lot of disagreement. There's issues to do with how do you define what a scientific method is, and even basic problems like the demarcation problem. What is science and what is pseudoscience? But anyway, for the purposes of this presentation, the standard thing we learn in schools, we'll just stick to that for now, right? So you ask a question, do some background research, construct a hypothesis, do some experimentations, then you come up with something like a theory. And again, it's important to distinguish what is a scientific theory as opposed to conspiracy theories or anything like that. A scientific theory is obviously something which is based on inferential evidence. It's not just, a sort of theory like a conspiracy theory. Anyway, why is science amazing? Because it works. We can actually put together testable predictions. We can do calculations. We can make an estimation. Where is Jupiter going to be in 6 months from now? And once we make that calculation, then after 6 months, we can confirm it. We can say this is where it actually is. So it's amazing because it actually works. However, it's important to understand just because something works doesn't mean it's true with a capital T. Doesn't mean it's absolutely true. Doesn't mean it's uncertain. That doesn't mean it's unassailable, that it's completely something that cannot be challenged. Science is based upon induction. You take a set of observations. From those set of observations, you make a general conclusion or you make a particular conclusion. So all my life, I'm a scientist. I've seen swans which are white. I've documented thousands of swans which are white. The next swan is going to be white, or all swans are white. That's induction. But however, you can have the problem of induction, which people like David Hume pointed out a long time ago, that you can always get a black swan. You can always get a novel piece of data which doesn't fit your existing theory. So no matter how well confirmed a scientific theory is, you can always have future observations that can contradict it. Likewise, we have the problem of underdetermination, which I try and explain through a scatter graph. You have these data points, you have these observations, you have these things that we know to be true. However, you can always make inferences apart from just the one inference, which is currently being accepted by scientists. And then you obviously have other problems like problem of unconceived alternatives and theory ladenness, and I'm not going to get into all of that. But the philosophy of science is there to teach us and remind us that science doesn't give us truth with a capital T. Things can always be revised. Things can always change. Now, what obviously doesn't change is the direct data that we have. Fossils, the shape of the earth, and, these types of things. We know, okay, these things do actually, are actually there. And from these things, we actually make inferences. However, science is more than just observations, because what sometimes happens is people say, well, science must be certain because we know that, the earth goes around the sun, not the other way around. So that's certain. So science is certain. But that's not, that's really not a good argument, because science is way more than just observations. Observations play a role in adjudicating, constructing, and delineating, according to some models, what is science and what is not science. However, it's not the entire thing. So, using observations, you can come up with astronomy. Using observations, you can come up with astrology, but they're both obviously not science. One of them is. Some theories which were well confirmed, made great predictions, were seen as unassailable, turned out to be not entirely true, such as the Newtonian model of the universe, which had, this particular concept of gravity, mass, and time and space being fixed. And later on, Einstein came along and changed the definition of mass, showed time and space is flexible, and even completely changed our perspective on the way that we view gravity. So something can work for a long time, but it doesn't mean that it's absolutely true. It doesn't mean that those things cannot be revised. And within the context of Newtonian mechanics to the Einsteinian revolution, we can see theory ladenness, we can see problem induction, we can see problem underdetermination, and we can see the problem of unconceived alternatives. We can see all these things playing out when we look at it retrospectively. Theories work even after we know that they're not the entire story. So, for example, we can still go on the moon based upon Newtonian mechanics, but that doesn't mean time and space is fixed. And likewise, there's other examples when we look at the literature. Theories work even when they contradict each other. So we have a well-confirmed theory in general relativity. We have quantum mechanics with all its various interpretations. But fundamentally, there's a contradiction when it comes to both of these models, in terms of general relativity and quantum mechanics. There's a contradiction, but both of them still work. And, if you pick up a book on philosophy of science, you find philosophers speaking about this. Historically, there being cases of theories that we believe to be false now, but that were empirically quite successful. And you get this, this whole problem of underdetermination, how you can have many different theories, but scientists just have to decide on one at a particular time. And this is something that you can find a lot of evidence for. And I'm not going to go through these quotations, but again, you get this again and again in terms of words like scientific proof are dangerous, and we should understand not everything is set in stone. Even when it comes to the likes of Richard Dawkins, who is a well-known Darwinist, a very good science writer, not a brilliant scientist, I would say, but definitely a very good popularizer of Darwinian evolution. Even he acknowledges in his book, A Devil's Chaplain, that new facts may come to light which can cause our successors to abandon Darwinism or modify beyond recognition. Here he's referring to not universal common ancestry, but here he's referring to natural selection being the primary mechanism of evolution. Darwinism is something which is based on a probabilistic framework. There are assumptions involved, and there are disputes, live core disputes about it. Now, why is this important? This is important because the way that Darwinism is projected in the public domain is something absolutely unquestionable, and we know this is a fact, and the way it's just pushed out, that's not really the way it is understood academically. In fact, somebody could respond and say, well, you're saying Darwinism is it has probabilities in there, there's assumptions in there with sub-assumptions, and there's disputes about the assumptions, and there's disputes conceptually and philosophically overall about the paradigm. But they could say, well, isn't that true about all scientific theories, not just Darwinism? And that is true. All scientific theories ultimately have assumptions, and they can have disputes, and they're obviously based on a probabilistic framework as well. However, the reason why I take time highlighting the issues with Darwinism is because of the way that it's propagated as if it's something completely that we just cannot even think about challenging. And I think that's simply not true. Now, regardless of if you have a Darwinist coming forward and saying, look, whether you look at biochemistry, genetics, anatomy, the fossil record, bioinformatics, or whatever it is, linguistics, psychology, you will all these fields will come to the same conclusion about Darwinism, about the efficacy of natural selection. And that's why I want to say, actually, no, that's not true. We have a lot of reasons to doubt that a claim about natural selection. Now, it's important to differentiate between evolution and Darwinism. I think this is extremely important. Evolution as a general idea that there's biological change over time. Species evolve, they change, they adapt. You have vestigial organs, you have species that use certain organs and then they stop using them, and others that develop them. This was known and theorized and discussed by, philosophers and scientists for pretty much thousands of years, right? We can go back to even the ancient Indus civilization, modern day Pakistan, right? Or modern day India, whatever you prefer. And you can see that amongst the philosophers there, amongst the naturalists there's a lot of discussion about evolution and biological change over time. And actually, this is an interesting point if you're a Desi, right? We think the Greeks were, the first people to do pretty much everything. But actually, no, it was the Indians, and arguably they've been whitewashed from history, and they influenced the Greeks, and not only in terms of mathematics, but in terms of other things as well. And the Greeks also spoke about evolution, so did the Babylonians, and so did others. But anyway, evolution as a general idea, biological change over time, well known even before Darwin. In fact, a well-known theory before Darwin was Lamarckian evolution, which had this idea of multiple origins and, inheritance of acquired characteristics, and, John Baptiste Lamarck pushing out this idea. And that was 1809, 1859, about 50 years later, we had the origin of species, in which Darwin is saying something totally different. He's saying it's not multiple different origins, it's one origin going back, which created this tree of life. And all of this was done primarily through natural selection, working on variations, mutations, and those things were not really known. Random mutations were not known at his time. In fact, genetics as a field was just not known to him, although there are some academics who say that he was made aware of some of this stuff. But from what we can see, it definitely wasn't incorporated in his theory. But anyway, later on with the modern synthesis, it became natural selection working on random mutations. So anyway, natural selection working on random mutations, that is supposed to be the main cause of the biological change that we see before us. In fact, the entire biological world, the adaptations that we see, there's many different schools of thought when it comes to adaptations and the causes and stuff. But the main thing is that the cause of these is natural selection. So if you see an adaptation, it's most likely caused by natural selection, or it could be a byproduct which was later co-opted or whatever. However, look, it's very important that although the idea is given like, look, this is unassailable, this is unquestionable, there's a lot of information that is missing from the record. And not just, we're talking about the fossil record here, but just in terms of even today, scientists studying and the amount of scientists that are studying compared to how much data is out there, we have just a fraction. And that's true with any scientific theory. But anyway, I thought this was an interesting way of putting it. In a science journal, it gives the example of working out the sort of history, the human evolutionary history, in a way that War and Peace, which is a big book for anybody who, it still orders books online as opposed to just getting, Kindle or whatever. It's like, saying if you had 13 randomly selected pages in War and Peace, and those had ink on them and you could see writing on them, but the rest of the pages were blank, what story could you make up? Well, a lot of stories. Likewise, the same analogy was given when it's how difficult it is to work out what happened in terms of human history. And, it's not just a scattergraph issue, which I raised before. It's like a scattergraph on steroids. There's a lot of interpretations that you can actually make. According to the National Science Foundation, 99.999% of species are unknown. We don't, have obviously the data for them. They are extinct, they're gone. So everything that we are basing it on is 0.0001%. And, some of these some of these narratives that we get in documentaries, in, sometimes even kids programs, how did this evolve? How did that evolve? Well, natural selection selected this because it has certain fitness benefits, and it was a reoccurring challenge in the ancestral environment and all of that. However, some evolutionary theorists have challenged this and said, look, these are just stories. So Richard Lewontin, who's still alive at Harvard, and Stephen Jay Gould, who passed away several years ago, they published a paper many, many years ago, 1970s, in which they just went to town against these type of stories. And they actually referred to them as just so stories from Rudyard Kipling's children's book. So how did the elephant get along, a trunk? Well, the alligator was trying to pull it into the water, and it kept fighting, and this type of thing. And they say, look, well, Stephen Jay Gould puts it this way, giving a coherent story which is consistent with natural selection is not evidence. It's just a coherent story. And so a lot of what we see in terms of documentaries and even popular books like The Blind Watchmaker, you get these types of stories, right? So this evolved because of this. Why do, this is an interesting one, why do women like the color red? Why do men like the color blue? Well, it's because in the ancestral environment in which our brains evolved, in the the psychological modules that were shaped by selection, men who had a particular mutation which allowed them to, they prefer the color blue. They used to see the color blue at the watering hole, and the sky is blue, and so on and so forth. And then the women who, they were dealing with red a lot because they were foraging and picking berries and apples and cutting meat or whatever it is. And therefore, the ones who preferred to like the color blue are more likely to survive in terms of males, and females, the color red. And this is how it was selected and fixed in the population. And then you have people like Raymond Tallis who turn around at these stories from evolutionary psychology, and they say this makes absolutely no sense. For the simple reason, not only one is that there's no evidence for this, and all you have is a story which is consistent with natural selection, but also that men liking the color blue and women liking the color red is a very Eurocentric way of looking at the problem, because that's not true in other parts of the world. In fact, it's not even true for Europe categorically, because about 150 years ago, around the Victorian good old times, men preferred red, and red was seen like a masculine color, and even pink was seen as a sort of version of red, and women liked the color blue. So even 150 years ago, it was very different. So people like Raymond Tallis, they point out these types of problems, because look, there's a theoretical way you can try and make things up, but then there's what actually exists in nature. Then there's the homology, homoplazy quagmire. So homology is the idea, and if it's just an assumption, right? If there's similarities, these similarities we assume is due to common ancestry, whether those are genetic or anatomical. That's what homology means today. However, we know of similarities that are not due to common ancestry, whether those are genetic or anatomical, and that's known as homoplasy. Now, the thing about homology is, even if homology is not challenged by homoplasy, homology is still just an assumption. And, we've got examples in terms of genetics, the echolocation in whales and the echolocation in bats independently evolved. And, the wing of a bat and the wing of a bird, these being, again, that's they were developed under independent selection pressures. Well, supposedly. Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Are you also, can you share your screen again?
Yeah, what happened there? How long did you lose me for?
Less than a minute, like around 20, 30 seconds or so.
All right, okay. I just randomly got muted and I had no idea what was going on. Can you guys see my screen now?
Yep.
Yep.
All right, brilliant. So again, when it comes to homology, it's an assumption, it's not a conclusion. And to say it's a conclusion would be circular reasoning, something we can get into later. So it's still based on a probabilistic framework. They have this, model of working it out, the maximum likelihood model or whatever it is. But again, it's not set in stone. It's an assumption that they have that if things are similar, then there's a common ancestor behind them. And previously, homology didn't even mean similarity due to common ancestry, whether it's genetic or anatomical. It meant similarity in structure and function. And later on, it actually changed. And, I found this interesting quotation when I was going through this book, Evidence in Evolution, by the philosopher of biology, Elliot Sober, in which he basically says, look, within a probabilistic framework, there is no must in either case about human-chimp ancestors. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't believe in it, but what it means is the must of it, that homology is the absolute, is absolute evidence. How did I get to this slide? Sorry about that. Here we go. And now there's obviously a lot of assumptions when it comes to Darwinian theory. So the obvious one is that natural selection is the driving force, it's the cause of adaptations. Genes are transmitted just purely vertically. So again, that could be challenged through horizontal gene transfer. A very gene-centric view as opposed to a cultural group selection view or group selection view or species view or whatever. Gradualism as opposed to punctuated equilibrium. Acquired characteristics not being inherited. So against that, again, that anti-Lamarckian sort of way of looking at things, and that mutations are random. According to some evolutionary academics like Dennis Noble, the central assumptions of neo-Darwinism have been disproven. Now, again, let me just reiterate, he's not the majority. He's a mainstream secular academic from Oxford. However, he doesn't represent the entire field. I'm just highlighting some differences here. And in terms of the assumptions, that's something which he challenges. Now, there's alternatives to the standard Darwinian model, evolution by natural genetic engineering, neo-mutationism, neo-Lamarckism, and then evolution by self-organization. I chucked it in there, but it's not really that popular. And the idea that Lynn Margulis had about the inheritance of acquired entire genomes, which again is not really that popular anymore. Third Way of Evolution is an interesting website. It's where the third way, meaning basically referring to, you have creationism, intelligent design, whatever you want to call it, then you get neo-Darwinism. And these guys, they want to say, actually, no, there is a third way. And that third way is that we believe it's not just natural selection, it's not creationism, there is something else going on here, and they try and push forward alternatives. So you get academics here from all over the world, Europe, North America, Princeton, Harvard, Oxford, you name it. You get academics from all over the world who are working on this project. Also, something else which is very interesting, and we can get into this into the Q&A. I don't want to read out these lengthy quotations. It'll bore everyone. It'll cure insomnia. And anyway, so there's a link between naturalism, which is the idea that everything can be explained via natural causes and effects, and Darwinism, because if naturalism is to be taken as the paradigm, which it currently is, methodological naturalism within science, then something like the Darwinian story has to be true by necessity. And there's an interesting quotation here by the biologist Richard Lewontin, in which he says, "We are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and set of concepts that produce material explanations. No matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated, moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." So long story short, what he's saying here, and what Gareth Nelson and others are saying, is materialism, naturalism, it colors the way you look at the data, which isn't to say it's something unique about Darwinism or unique within science, but it's there, and that has a huge impact in terms of the way that the data is understood. Darwinism is unique because it's not just a scientific theory. It is way more than that. It is an ethical, political, religious perspective as well. This is a really interesting aspect of Darwinism, which is why it's not just a scientific theory. It is a valid scientific model theory paradigm, but it's something also beyond that. So Julian Huxley, you can see there in black and white, very interesting character. He was the president of UNESCO, which is the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. Hardcore Darwinist, hardcore atheist. He's a biologist as well. And he believed Darwinism not just to be a scientific theory. He believed it to be a religious worldview. And he wrote this book, very interesting book. You can see it's quite old, Religion Without Revelation. I'd highly recommend you get a PDF of this book. You might be able to get a physical copy, but this is from the 1940s and it's difficult to get your hands on it. In fact, just as a side point, and I sometimes go off on tangents, I'm sorry. Right in the beginning, because he wrote this book in the early 40s, right? So he wrote this just as World War II was raging on. And right in the preface, he actually talks about the rise of communism and Nazism, and it's quite interesting. And he also compares them to religion as well. So anyway, religion without revelation, here he's referring to Darwinism. Darwinism is the religion without revelation. And in another book, New Bottles for New Wine, he also makes the same argument for a new religion for mankind, meaning Darwinism is a replacement for conventional religions like Christianity, Islam, and others. So it's obviously more than just science for him. And he was an important person. He was the president of UNESCO. He was a evolutionary theorist, evolutionary biologist. He had a lot of impact in terms of the development of the modern synthesis, and also the proponents of the modern synthesis, and even the proponents of Darwinism today. It's highly unlikely that you are a Darwinist worth your salt today, except that you have read the writings of Julian Huxley, been influenced by them, or on the minimum, you're aware of his status within the field. So he was in no doubt that this is more than just science. Likewise, we have Richard Dawkins in The Blind Watchmaker in the 1980s. You know, the good old times when we had things like the A-Team on TV. You guys are too young for that. Anyway, so Richard Dawkins in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, he says, Darwin allowed us to be intellectually satisfied atheists. It's quite a strange statement. Would you really hear someone saying, string theory allowed us to be intellectually satisfied atheists or Buddhists or whatever? There's something strange going on. This is something which doesn't really make sense for reasons that I'm going to go into later. I mean, the part about Darwinism leading to atheism. Likewise, Michael Roos, who has written a wonderful book, which was recently published, recently as in the last 4 years, compared to 1940, so that's pretty recent. He basically argues that, and you can, I mean, even the name of the book is quite provocative. So he says Darwinism as religion, right? And it's published by Oxford University. So, and he's an atheist. So is Huxley. So is, Dawkins. But they recognize there's something more to this theory than just science. And what he argues in the book, A Religion Without Revelation, is that Darwinism has been and still is more than just a valid scientific theory. It is a secular religious alternative to the standard sort of religions, theistic religions in particular. So it's more than just a theory, and that's because of its implications. And also things are, if you don't believe in God, then something like a Darwinian history of life is true by default, regardless of scientific evidence. And likewise, it's like a feedback loop. If you're a Darwinist, then they also push that Darwinism leads to atheism, which is a big part of the new atheist narrative. And definitely, it's a scientific theory which has done a lot of damage, and it's been used to justify imperialism, racism, xenophobia, all sorts of things. So it's not just a scientific theory, as in it's more than that, not only from a religious perspective, but also its sociological impact. And there's some other stuff on this. I can't be bothered to go into that now. So we're reaching about the 45-minute mark. Last slide. It's extremely important for us as Muslims, just to summarize. We have no problem with science. Muslims contributed to science. Muslims led to the origin of the modern scientific inductive method, not just science overall, but the modern inductive scientific method, which Ibn Haytham pushed. Evolution is something different to Darwinism. How the Islamic miracles fit within evolution or fit within science, we can do that in the Q&A, inshallah. But the important thing to take away here is we have reasons and evidence for why we believe the Quran to be true. And if there's something in science which is contradicting the Quran, we don't just give up and say why we choose science over the Quran or the Quran over science. We actually say, no, we believe in the Quran because we give it higher epistemic weight, but science can revise, science can change. It can always give you scientific theory. It can always give you theories which can be revised. So we'll accept it as a working model, whether it's Newtonian mechanics, whether it's string theory or Darwinian evolution. We'll accept it as valid science, but we won't accept it to be absolutely true. Now, before we get into the Q&A, just some quick things I want to mention. There is a lot of discussion happening in terms of Islam and Islamic models of evolution and creation of Adam, and all these types of things in which people try and fuse some evolutionary models with Islam and try and make some exceptions, other times not try and do stuff. I stay away from all of those approaches. I don't think they're very helpful. And from a dawah perspective, from a perspective of propagating Islam, it's enough for us to just show that Darwinism isn't absolute, nor is anything else in science, and that we accept it as a valid theory model paradigm, but it cannot undermine the truthfulness of Islam. And also, I think this point is extremely important. Darwin was not an atheist. Darwin never believed that his theory led to atheism. He, in fact, openly criticized those who said that evolution or Darwinism leads to atheism. And he said in his wildest fluctuations, he was never an atheist. So again, why is this theory so contentious? It's because of the way, not only the way that it was co-opted by certain people to become into more than a theory, into a religion, co-opted by others to justify imperialism, but also co-opted by others to try and push a new atheist narrative by saying Darwinism leads to atheism, which is something Richard Dawkins really pushes in his book, The God Delusion. So it's extremely important for us to understand that, and even in the field of dawah, of conveying the message of Islam, it's important to emphasize that point, because if you deny God, then you deny miracles and you deny revelation, everything goes. But if we can show, firstly, Darwinism, even if it's to be accepted as a valid scientific theory and not challenged from a philosophy of science point of view or from a scientific point of view, it still doesn't mean there's no God. It still doesn't lead to those conclusions which are being attributed to it. So when that is made clear, that opens the route to show why Islam is true, and also show why we believe in miracles, and miracles such as the virgin birth or the creation of Adam alayhi salam. So everything good I've said is from Allah, every mistake is from myself, and I look forward to your questions.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Suboor, for that presentation. I'm going to send you some questions that we got so far, and yeah, if anybody has questions, they can unmute themselves as well and ask them. Ahmed, if you can allow people to unmute themselves, that'd be great.
Brilliant.
Sorry, is there some sort of order for the questions?
It's a natural selection.
All right, sweet.
Survival of
Can
the
I
fastest.
can I go ahead then?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, 1 second. Okay, so Assalamu alaikum, Brother Suboor. Thank you for coming, and thank you the Mac MSA for doing this. First of all, yeah, I want to start by saying thank you to Brother Suboor. Like, I've been following your work for a while, and the work that you've put out and the material you've put out has been so beneficial to myself, and I'm sure to many other Muslims all around the world, and people who are just starting to learn about the discourse between theology and science. So thank you for that. So now to move on to my question, I know in the past, in some debates and some of the materials you put out, you've spoken against the side of, or not the side, the opinion of holding intelligent design is a valid scientific theory or a valid scientific position. I know that since then you've moved away from that. By the way, please correct me if I'm wrong anywhere here.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could maybe give us some clarity on where are you in your progression, as in what's your personal views in your evolution, maybe, or what's your personal view on intelligent design as of now? Because I know you've talked with Paul Nelson and others.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a very good question, brother Ismail, and thank you for raising that. The thing is, and firstly, I think I just want to make a general point about social media before I get into it. So in the world of social media, we all are influencers, big or smaller capacity, but we all are. And one of the dangers is when you say something, then it goes out there, and then you're like, after some time you learn something else, and you're like, ooh, shouldn't I have said that? And that's basically what happened with my view on intelligent design. So, I mean, even my earlier views on intelligent design were more pro. They were a lot more pro. It was like, no, this makes complete sense. We got to do it. You know, I was a big fan of, Michael Behe, Stephen Myers, Paul Nelson. I still am, but that was the angle, right? And then later on, I started thinking, do you know what? Pushing intelligent design is a double-edged sword, because what we're going to end up doing is we're going to end up reinforcing the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is scientism. It's not even Darwinism. It's the idea that everything that science is telling us is basically true, and science is the main root of knowledge. And what we get from spirituality, what we get from religion, what we get from even other ways, secularized ways of thinking, like philosophy and just other things like testimony, those aren't important. It's all about science. So because Darwinism is on the top, we need to beat Darwinism, replace it with ID, and then we have a mantle. But it just reinforces the idea of scientism. So I was like, that doesn't make any sense. And then I fell into the trap of purely accepting methodological naturalism, hook, line, and sinker. I was like, well, if methodological naturalism is the way that science works, ID doesn't fit that. But then later on, I realized, well, should I really accept that methodological naturalism is the default position and it should be the default position? Should I really accept the idea that, yes, we should challenge scientism? However, sociologically, the impact of not challenging Darwinism also has harm. So then I started to realize, okay, things are a bit here, they're not really that clear. I had some discussions with Sheikh Osman Ali. He's a great brother who's, he's an evolutionary biologist and he's an alim. And his view was, it's a good stopper. He's not fully supporting ID, but it's a good stopper. And then there's obviously Professor Shoaib Ahmed Malik, who's of the view that he doesn't support ID. So I'm still entangled. I'm still confused about it. But what I would say is sociologically challenging Darwinism is very important. And the intelligent design narrative is a very powerful stopper. So I do agree with Sheikh Osman. Methodological naturalism, should it be accepted totally? Should we accept it for a pragmatic point of view? I wave around in terms of that view. But for me, I think one thing I would definitely say is the overriding problem is still there, which is we have turned science and scientism into a type of taghut, into a type of idol. And anything which is not verifiable, scientifically justifiable, or it's not out there. And then, you know, what we do is we set a standard that goes against the Islamic standard and doesn't make any sense, because if we were to just use our senses, we wouldn't acquire any knowledge, let alone spiritual knowledge. And over the number of years, I've come to realize that when I was at university many years ago, I wish somebody had just told me that it's not just about science. It's not just about using even reason. There is an element of spirituality and your heart and sincerity, and you have a fitra which is awoken through these reasons. It's not just that we're rational machines that you input some data and we get hadaya, right? There is an element of, there's a huge element of your spiritual state, how you see the world, and the role the fitra plays in that. And I think supporting ID can go against that. But then there's other brothers who've also said to me, actually, no, that's not the case, because, you know, studying, some people turn away from biology because of the Darwinian paradigm. So having ID would make them more likely to appreciate nature, and then that will awaken their fitra. I don't really know, to be long story short, and I may even, you know, again, do a U-turn and go against ID. But the bottom line for me, which is the most important, is we should stop treating science as a taghut, right? That is for me a persistent, perpetual problem, whichever camp you go into, it rears its ugly head. And I think that's what I really want to get across, inshallah. Any other questions?
I sent you some questions we got on the Google form. If you can see it in the text chat.
Can you read out a question?
Yeah, sure. I can read them. So the first one is, why is there such a big difference between the academic and lay understanding of evolution?
Okay, so firstly, generally, there's a difference between how science is practiced and the way it's perceived. That's just a general problem. With Darwinism, there's an additional problem of atheists using it to propagate their view. And then also the fact that it's more than just science, it's a religious perspective as well. And it's something which was used to justify imperialism. And, you know, Darwin wrote many colorful things in The Descent of Man as well. So there's a lot at stake. It's not just the scientific theory like string theory or whatever. There is a lot more at stake. And that's why there's a lot of propaganda.
Okay, next question. Taking courses, actually, sorry, there's a brother who wants to ask a question. It's Brother Sahil, I see you've raised your hand. You can unmute yourself and ask a question, inshallah.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum. So I've been following Brother Suboor Ahmad on YouTube for quite a long time. And I have a question from his videos. One of the things that he mentions about observations. Now, observations are absolute truths in science, while theories are not. So I need to know, how does Islam looks upon the fossils records that are found 100,000, 150, 100,000 years ago, which which are not consistent with how things are mentioned related to Adam alayhi salam and his offsprings. For example, Denisovians or Neanderthals, their physical structures were a little different than humans, and certain things were also different from humans. But those things are not in reference to, when we read Quran, we don't find those kind of things with Adam alayhi salam. So how does Islam looks upon this?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, Brother Sahil. And I think you were talking to me on Instagram, and
Instagram.
I didn't respond to your message. I need to do that. Apologies. So the thing is, look, a general principle in Islam is that where Allah is silent on a thing, then we are silent on that thing. Now, Allah says in the Quran that He created that which you don't know. So there may be things which are weirder looking than dinosaurs, which may have existed. Allah doesn't mention them. Allah doesn't mention the, for example, the sea pig, right? This pig-looking creature, which is actually a fish, which walks around at the bottom of the ocean. Allah has created a magnificent universe with a lot of biodiversity. Denisovans, Homo naledi, Homo erectus, and all these types of things, absolutely compatible with the Quran. What is the issue? It's one of those things that when we first hear it, we think to ourselves, oh, why isn't it mentioned in the Quran? And the reason why we think that is the same reason why sometimes atheists have said to me, why doesn't God mention dinosaurs? It's because we have this idea that every single thing has to be mentioned in the Quran. The Quran doesn't even mention how to make wudu, right? Why would it mention Denisovans? Why would it mention the fiqh that was followed by, Nuh alayhi salam or something, right? The Quran just has enough for you to connect with your Creator. What we get from the prophetic teachings is how to worship Allah in a deeper way. But the Quran is there to change the state of your heart, and it's not going to have superfluous information. I mean, the sleepers of the cave, were they 7 of them or 6 of them or 5 of them or whatever? Allah says this is superfluous. This is not important. What's important is the story. Likewise, whatever Allah created. When I look at those things, I find them fascinating. It definitely makes me appreciate how insignificant we are. We've been on this planet for a few thousand years, and we think we know it all when these things were around millions of years ago. It definitely is very humbling. And also it kind of reminds me of, the narration of the Prophet ﷺ, where he spoke about the Day of Judgment coming and him being one of the signs of the Day of Judgment, and how everything in terms of the prophecies of Islam and the minor signs and how they're being fulfilled, and there's only a few minor signs and then there's major signs. And if you go back to the beginning of life on earth, that's like 4 billion years ago, it does make sense when the Prophet ﷺ is saying that we're on our last part of this this journey. And there's definitely a lot of things out there which even today, with all of our science and all the scientists, the majority of the living organisms within the oceans, we don't know. We don't know about these species. We don't know about the way they live. We don't know about things that are alive right now, and Allah doesn't mention in the Quran, let alone things that existed a long time ago. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that answered my question. And you remember I told you that my research was also on the similar topic. So one of the things that I found out in that was that in the genus of Homos, all the human species, all the Homo species got extinct, and only Homo sapiens are today alive, and it is the Homo sapiens that are present on the whole surface of Earth. So like even that fossil data also talks about common origins of all the humans, because that's where we have descended. So like Quran also talks about common descendants, and I guess this part of fossil data is also consistent with what Quran says. So do you think that this is a valid argument? Maybe not absolute valid, but just a little bit.
I'm of the view that nothing should be compared with the Quranic verses, simply because of the way that, firstly, the purpose of those verses is not to give you scientific information, and 2, scientific information which we use to compare with certain Quranic verses is always going to be susceptible to change. The purpose of us having the Quran is for us to be closer to Allah. It's not for us to gain information about the natural world. That's why we do science. The Prophet ﷺ told us, reflect upon creation, do not reflect upon Allah. Do not reflect upon the essence of Allah. Because you cannot, basically the narration that I'm paraphrasing here, because you cannot comprehend the essence of Allah. So reflecting about nature, which is what scientists essentially end up doing for most of their part when they're not, going for research grants and stuff like that. That for Islam is a religious imperative. We do that. So, sorry, what was your question again? I don't know how I got to this point.
Oh, okay. So yeah, your answer kind of answers it. So the question was in terms of how only Homo sapiens, that species of Homo genus.
Oh, he said, comparing it with the Quran.
Yeah.
Again, I would say, look, Allah says, we did not make you witnesses to your creation or to the creation of the heavens and the earth. Yeah. This is why when you have certain Islamic people in the past, certain Islamic personalities today who talk about the gradualistic creation of Adam alayhi salam, or they talk about various different things, I don't get into any of that. I just stick to what Allah says in the Quran, which is, do not talk about what you don't know. Now, I'm not saying that they should be refuted or they should be challenged or this or that. I'm not into that. But for the purposes of dawah, those things are irrelevant. Those things are irrelevant. So what's important from a dawah perspective is we just need to show people why Islam is true, why the Quran is a miracle. Comparing the Quran to science and to try and make it cohere, I would challenge that in this way. I would say, make the story of Maryam alayhi salam and the virgin birth of Isa alayhi salam compatible with any understanding of the way reproduction works. You cannot. There is nothing, right? So why do we believe in it? We believe in it because Allah says so, and it's a miracle. And why do we believe in the Quran? This is why we believe in the Quran. However, if we go down this route of let's see if it coheres, we can try and do that with evolution or evolutionary findings or with something else. And some people have tried to work out the speed of light using the Quran. But then how are you going to do it when it comes to the virgin birth? Because we have this feeling we have to do, we have to compare. Some people, sadly, have gone to the extent of denying the virgin birth and trying to twist the verses of the Quran to say that the Quran doesn't even mention a virgin birth and it's actually referring to this. And that's why it's a slippery slope. And that's why the main target that we have is scientism, right? I'm not saying that's your intention, but even this way of thinking, how do we compare the Quran to what we have in science? It'll eventually lead to this scientific type of understanding.
Brother Ahmad, I saw that your hand was up, but I just want to, we got some questions earlier in the Google form. I just want to get to one of those ones first, and then you can ask your question. Okay, another question we got was, just scroll up. So the question is, taking courses about anthropology that might support some ideas that are against Islam, what are we supposed to do to stay safe from these ideas?
Well, they wouldn't go against Islam if it was properly understood what is the role of the philosophy of science here. Does science lead to certainty? How did methodological naturalism shape Darwinian theory? Now, I totally appreciate some Muslims who have no understanding of philosophy of science, plus are spiritually weak. They could just end up going to these things and then thinking, oh, evolution's true, I don't believe in God anymore, I'm confused. I appreciate that can happen. But if you're somebody that's nuanced, you're on this webinar, you understand philosophy of science, you understand why the Quran is a miracle, you're strong in terms of understanding the foundations of Islam, and you're from that perspective, you are intellectually equipped. I just don't see why studying anthropology or studying, bioinformatics or whatever, why that would be problematic for someone like that.
So, okay, Brother Ammar, you can ask your question if you have one.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi. I hope you guys can hear me well. Jazakallah khair, Brother Suboor. We're really honored to have you here. I just want I have just a few minutes, and then I need to leave. But I want to say something. So right now I'm in my third year of medical science, and I've been doing a lot of medical research. Alhamdulillah, with a bunch of labs. And to be honest, this question has come across me since first year, and after a lot of research, what I came to know is that, and with being completely frank and blunt, the idea that an order can come from disorder or can come from randomness is pure nonsense. And the idea that a cell can emerge from pure scientific perspective, a cell or a string of DNA can emerge and have a functional role from non-order, from randomness, from blind coincidences, is just ridiculous. And I think, to be honest, from my view, how I like to look at this topic is to look back into discovering or thinking about the origin of what we see. So the origin of life, the origin of DNA, the origin of reproduction. How did the idea of reproduction come in the first place? How did the idea of flying come in the first place? How did, let's say, fish turn into creations that can walk on land, and the 3D to 2D dimensional network and neuronal networks transform? How did bones emerge? And to be honest, my very first year, or I was taking a course about evolution, and the professor he tried to explain how bones emerged, because just from a scientific background, you can't have bones come from DNA, because DNA only produces amino acids, which produce proteins. DNA cannot even produce carbohydrates. So he was like, we don't know, but we think that somehow, somewhere in the ocean, back how many million years ago, you had this cloud, or sorry, this stone of calcium that dropped to the ocean and kind of propagates into the fish, the body of the fish, and then somehow turn into bones. And I to be honest, I laughed out loud in the class. This is how funny this idea can be. So to me, just having life as as a person who studies science, just looking at life and looking at these questions and how can they emerge from randomness, to me it clearly makes no sense. I'm not even going into the details about the cell, and just questions from my own research on I do research in autophagy, and there's tons of pathways are happening intertwined, and saying that all this can emerge from randomness is a pure joke. So I just want to share my perspective, and I really appreciate what you told us about the philosophy of science, and I did actually read about this before, and mashallah, I really think it's very coherent. Barakallahu feek.
Jazakallah khair, Omar. And I totally agree. The thing is, look, I'll share something with you guys. When I was around your age, right, many years ago, I was convinced that universal common ancestry was true, right? I was convinced the human chimp ancestry was true, and that I was convinced this is in line with the Quran. Of course, I don't believe that anymore, but I was convinced. And I was convinced that the entire Darwinian story was nonsense. So I was an evolutionist who believed that Allah basically led the evolutionary forces. I just, exactly like you said, I was like, okay, so when you read the Darwinian sort of stuff, you can get into this thing where you start accepting stuff. But when it comes to the nonsense about natural selection creating this and creating that, and how did this come, how did that come, RNA models of how abiogenesis and all this stuff, just you're like, no, sorry, that does not make any sense. It makes zero sense. And it just, for me, it was just bizarre how somebody could even believe this. You'd have to be an atheist in order to make those conclusions. Because if you're an atheist, then there has to be, like your professor said, maybe some calcium in the ocean or whatever it is, and whatever arguments they make. If there's no God, then they absolutely have to do that. Now, when you were talking, And Jazakallah khair for sharing your story. I was remembering a friend of mine. He was a militant atheist. He is a militant atheist, typical atheist from a Christian background, became a militant atheist. He used to bash religious people. He wasn't just an atheist, he was an anti-theist. He used to find religious people and bash them. And he was in university, he was studying evolutionary biology. And one day he was studying the cell, and you mentioned the cell. And he was just looking at, the cell is a mini city, you know that. You know all the sort of intricate design that's there. And he said he was staring at the cell and he just thought to himself, no, I don't believe this. I don't believe this is the product of randomness, of essentially natural selection working on random. I just don't understand this. And that crack in his atheism eventually led him to just doubt naturalism. And he started over time believing in God. He said to me, he started even looking at nature and the stars, and eventually, alhamdulillah, he became a Muslim. But the crack was the cell. He was like, what the heck? Like, I just don't, doesn't make any sense. This is also why I don't get into lengthy debates with atheists, with Darwinists, when it comes to even Darwinian theory itself, about its probabilistic framework, assumptions, disputes, whether it's a religion or not. I simply say, how does it undermine God's existence? Even if it's true, even if everything you're saying to me is true, how does it undermine God's existence? Once they realize it doesn't, and their argument against God is undermined, then with the belief in God comes what? Miracles are possible, the revelation of the Quran, all these things. This is why I think it's extremely important not to get bogged down in the science and realize the greater theological issue that's going on here. Your lens that you look at the data, it colors the data. So it's important, even though I gave this presentation and I covered a lot of scientific jargon, the main thing is Darwinism doesn't undermine God's existence. That's the main thing. And you definitely put it in a very interesting way that, they don't really have an answer.
Barakallahu fikum, barakallahu fikum. Yeah, and to be honest, when I start thinking about this, I just start loving my own discipline even more. SubhanAllah, it's really great, and there's as much evidences as infinity to refute the possibility of the ability of life to emerge from randomness. So jazakallah khair, barakallahu fikum.
Jazakallah khair.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Suboor, for that answer. Brother Sayyid, I see that your hand's up. I just want to get to a question we got on the Google form that was asked earlier. So the question is, I've heard and realized that science explains the how in life, while religion/philosophy explains the why. Considering that most religious concepts cannot be scientifically proven, brackets, correct me if I'm wrong, how can one offer da'wah to those that are too stubborn in terms of being atheist or hardcore scientism/Darwinism believers?
Very good question. The way to answer that question, the way to answer those people who are hardcore scientists and so believe in scientism, is to show them that scientism is not coherent. You don't need to show them scientism is not coherent using the Quran or the Sunnah or Islam. You can show them that we have metaphysics, right? We have the fact that the world is real, that the world wasn't created 5 minutes ago. We have morals, we have mathematics and logic, we have testimony, we have reason, we have all these roots of knowledge, and all of these things which don't fit within the science, which don't come out of science, which science presupposes. So if you're going to say, I only believe in science, even the sentence, I only believe in science, is not a scientific statement. And nor is the logic, the maths which scientists use, nor is the testimony which scientists use, nor is even reasoning which is used within scientific theorizing. All of these things are not science, but science needs them. They're needed before you actually do science. So that's the way to challenge it. Also, no one really lives their life with, I only believe in science. No one does. Okay, so should I take this mug, right, and should I drink water, or shall I just throw it at a cat? Yeah, I mean that's a dilemma, really, right? It's a question, not a dilemma. It's a question. So should I just drink it, or should I just throw it at the cat? Science can tell you, if you drink it, this is what's going to happen. If you throw it at the cat, that's what's going to happen. But it can't tell you right and wrong. No one lives their life according to, what does science say about throwing a mug at a cat? No one does that. That's you use your reasoning, use your moral instincts. You don't use science. Look at the major things in the world. Like, for example, when people were joining the chat, you know, it makes you say he, she, or whatever, what pronouns. Yeah, you have to, so you have to say what is your pronoun. So that's the thing now, right? That gender equality and gender identity, and, you know, LBGT, feminism, Me Too, like you have all these movements around the world. And essentially, when you speak to the people who are pushing all these different narratives, they believe they have a moral argument. No one gives you a scientific argument. Everyone gives you a moral argument. I believe this to be the case. So you have feminists who are making this case, you have feminists who are making their own cases, but everybody's making an argument essentially based on morals. Look at the civil rights movement. Look at the crazy people taking over the White House, right? Everything begins, all these social movements, human history, you can even look at it from a macro perspective, it is fundamentally about moral things. But those moral things are not things you can put in a test tube, right? No one lives their life in the way that they believe in scientism. No one does. So, you know, we should just remind them of how limited and how wrong that perspective actually is.
Jazakallah khair for that answer. Brother Sayyid, you can ask your question now. Follow.
Oh, thank you. Brother Suboor, that was really good. I had a quick question to clarify on the difference between a Darwinism, evolution, and natural selection, because I felt like you were jumping between the terms. I didn't really understand.
Okay, good. So firstly, sometimes these things are used interchangeably, and that's why I defined evolution as biological change over time. Darwinism, or neo-Darwinism, I should say rather, is the idea that natural selection working on random mutations is the driving force of evolution, is the driving force of the tree of life. So evolution, you can have evolutionary models which are non-Darwinian, and natural selection is basically, natural selection is something, again, which can fit within other evolutionary models. But what Darwinism is basically saying is that natural selection is the primary driving force of evolution, right? So I appreciate, even within, like, even the way I explained it now, I can imagine a Darwinist saying, well, that's not quite right, because today we use the word evolution in the sense that we're referring to adaptations which are developed by natural selection. But it gets really messy when someone does that. So that's the way I define it. I define evolution as biological change over time, which was known even before Darwin. Darwinism as natural selection being the primary driving force of evolution.
Right. Okay. So, yeah, that makes sense. So if that's the case, then you accept that you would have to accept that evolution is something that occurs, right? While dispute is on whether the theory of natural selection is like correct or not.
Yeah.
Like you accept that evolution is real, it happens, but you don't accept the theory of natural selection, which is the process of evolution.
Yeah. So, and even when I say that I accept evolution, that doesn't mean I accept universal common ancestry. It means I accept biological change over time happens, speciation happens. You know, it doesn't mean I'm committed to one universal common ancestor, right?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, another question we got on the Google form question is, don't we Muslims believe that science is a, quote in quotation marks, work of God?
We don't believe science is a work of God. We believe what scientists study is a work of God. But of course, Allah says in the Quran that He created us in our actions. So in a way, I see what they're saying. Everything ultimately is a work of God. I get that. But Allah is telling us again and again in the Quran to study the world. And people think that means Allah's endorsing science or Islam is endorsing science. I can see why they would say that, but it's more than just science. Science is just the application of reason to a natural world in a particular way. But looking at the world is a wider general domain, if you like, and science is a subset of that. So we definitely as Muslims have a moral imperative to study science and do science, but I wouldn't put it in those words that Allah is, like science is a work of God. I wouldn't put it in those sense. Again, remember what I keep reiterating, yeah? Science is being deified. Science is becoming to a new taghut, right? And that's something we should be always careful of, because what I find amongst some Muslims, especially Muslims who are very much influenced by scientism, there's almost this anxiety that we need to upgrade the Quran to be in line with string theory or quantum mechanics, so it has to fit something in the Quran, or this is what it must be referring to. For example, Allah says in the Quran, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, all praises for Allah, the Lord of the worlds, right? What this is referring to is worlds, many worlds hypothesis. And people run away with this stuff. I have heard people go crazy, like literally, Allah is referring here to worlds, meaning more than one. And no, Alameen, everything. Yeah, it's we know of the scientific miracles narrative. Yeah, so it's very, very important that we stay away from all those things.
Okay, another question we got was, can change in species occur, or is it just changes in the characteristics of the species?
I mean, it obviously depends on the way that you define species, but I don't really see an issue with speciation as a thing. There are some Muslims who say, no, we cannot even allow speciation. No, everything was created individually and species don't change. They've just accepted a North American born-again Christian narrative and superimposed it on the Quran and the Sunnah. From an Islamic perspective, okay, you have speciation. Like, what's the big deal here? It's not an issue.
Okay. That's it for the questions we got in Google Form. Is anybody, okay, I think Sayyid raised his hand again.
Thank you. Just on the speciation front, wouldn't allowing speciation in Islam mean that at some point we could face an argument where there are people claiming this group of humans aren't like Homo sapien humans anymore? They're like a new type of human. And now we're like, we're having to confront a new argument about what species is. Does Islam count for these new humans, or do they not? Would it not be easier for us to say speciation doesn't happen?
I see where you're going with this. I would say no. Yes, people may make that argument, but that's just a byproduct of just human beings. We will run away with something. I mean, if someone makes that argument in the future, or even now, possibly, we will have to address it using the Quranic paradigm and say, actually, no, the creation of Adam alayhi salam, Adam's a unique creation with no ancestors, with no parents. Other things, was there speciation between different hominids? Perhaps, Allah knows best. But yeah, that's what I would do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, if anybody has any other questions, just raise your hand and you can ask them. Okay, I think Sahil has another question.
Okay. Yeah, so a very popular quote by Albert Einstein is that science without religion is lame and religion without science is blind. Now, do you think that there are problems with this quote? Because like I feel that there are, but like what do you think are problems with this quote?
Okay, I have a problem with, you see, when the atheists are talking to us, they say you with your religion and we are irreligious, we're secular. When everybody has a religion, right? I mean, new atheism acts like a religion. Some academics have spoken about that. Darwinism is a religion. Liberalism is absolutely a religion, without a doubt. Even the religion of human rights, right? That baseless. So religion is a term which sometimes Muslim apologists, what they do is they accept it and they start defending religion itself. Islam doesn't teach us to defend religion. It teaches us to defend Islam, right? So even with quotes like religion without science is lame, science without religion, like again, I'm not happy even with the term religion, because it's not religion versus non-religion. Everyone has a religion. And for us as Muslims, we openly say that Islam is the religion of truth. It's the only religion acceptable in the sight of Allah. It supersedes any revelations which came, and it is a religion which is going to spread into every house on earth. We have no shame saying that. We have no problem saying that. Even I just want to make this general point since we're ending anyway. You know, when I was at university, I'm not sure what it's like in your university, probably similar. You know, there was this, you know, because when I went to school and high school and, you know, just growing up in the West, you know, you sometimes start looking at, you know, everyone has their way, all rivers lead to the same ocean and everything is equal. So long as you don't harm anybody else, whatever everybody else does is fine. Whatever you do in your private life is fine. You know, just this type of perspective. The thing is, Islam doesn't really say that. Islam says that we are not free. We're not free of responsibility. We were created by a creator. And not only do we have a duty to the creator, we have a duty to remind others of that duty to the creator. And that ultimately it is the submission to God which God accepts. And what I've seen is a dichotomy, right? And I've seen like people who should be in a perfect place to practice Islam, a perfect place to practice Islam. They move away from Islam. They do stupid things. And people who, according to their circumstances, are in the worst position, they hold on to Islam for dear life. There's one particular thing I remember, that when I went to university, I was from Oxford, and Oxford doesn't really have that many Muslims. And I moved to London. London has lots of Muslims. London's like 10% Muslims. I was like, wow, so many Muslims. And when I went to university, it's for the first time I actually saw hijabi women, right, with boyfriends. It's the first time ever. And I was like, what the hell is this? Like, Oxford is like a village, right? So everyone knows each other, and, you know, you have to mind your own business type of thing, you know, and it's a very small town, small Muslim community. There's 3 mosques, all the Muslims know each other and this type of thing. So to go from a place where Muslims act like Muslims, and even if someone does something behind closed doors, to London where there's lots of Muslims, but then there's like people, like women wearing hijab with boyfriends. And I'm kind of thinking, and even kissing in public. And I'm thinking, what the hell is this? Like, what the hell is this? And I remember I wasn't even practicing at the time. I was just like a Jummah Muslim, right? But I just thought, what the hell is this? And I remember I went to a talk set up by our ISOC, our MSA, and they're a wonderful group of brothers. And there's this talk called Mum, I'm Muslim, right? And it was a talk by people who came to Islam. And what was shocking for me was that there was a English sister, a niqabi, who was giving a talk, and she said I leave my house without hijab. I leave my house just in the way a normal person wears clothes in London, jeans, shirt, dress, whatever, goes outside, wears a jilbab, puts on the hijab, puts on the niqab, goes to university. Why? Because her family hates Islam. She goes to university, does her lessons, comes back, takes off the hijab, puts it in the bag, walks home, can't even pray in her own room. She actually goes to the toilet, puts down a towel, puts on the shower, and then prays. And I'm thinking, oh my God, you get Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Indian, Moroccan, other sisters born in Muslim households who take off the hijab, then go to university, come back home, put it on, and I literally just, for me, it's Allah guides whom He wills, and Allah is free. Allah is free of need. Yeah. So it could be Islam is on a plate for you, and you're like, no thanks. And other people have to fight for the crumbs, and they will keep fighting for them because they want a little piece of Islam. Yeah. So when you're at university, I mean, I love giving talks, and one of the things I always want to get across to university students is the decisions that you're going to make now. And whoever's watching, please listen to this very carefully. Forget this evolution talk. The decisions you're going to make now in this age bracket of 18 to 22, right? That's going to impact the rest of your life. Honestly, people who in this time where, to be honest, look, your hormones are all over the place, lots of fitna, lots of problems, lots of things that could go wrong, materialism, all this stuff, social media. You could, if you fight now and you fight for Islam, I'm not asking you to be perfect, but you're trying. Yeah. The next 20 years, 30 years, you're going to be on a trajectory. And the people who are just giving in, they're going to be on a trajectory, and it affects everything. It affects future marriages. It affects the fact that, I'm 30 now, I'm 35. I'm happy being 35. I have no problem being 35. I have no problem having a little bit of balding and a little bit of, gray hair. I'm fine with that. But people who messed around in university, people who did all the haram and did all those types of things, they're like, oh my God, I'm getting old. Oh my God, I'm not young. And they're still acting young. And they still have the same habits they had when they're 21. They still haven't grown at all. And this is why it's extremely important that at this age, you make a struggle for the sake of Allah. You make a sincere struggle for the sake of Allah, or else you're going to have a miserable 20, 30 years after that. And nothing to do with the topic, but I wanted to share that with you guys.
Jazakallah khair for that. It's very insightful. I think Ismail has another question.
Yeah. Brother, so I wanted to just get like a solid clarification on maybe what's the comprehensive way to deal with dawah with regards to our topic, right? With regards to the evolution, keeping that in mind, I say. So the approach I'm understanding is we first want to level the playing field, because there is this sort of looking down upon people who are religious, quote unquote. We need to make the playing field equal and bring to the forefront the idea that everybody actually has a religion, where just because you don't believe in a deity doesn't mean you are not religious. So that's once we level the playing field, the most comprehensive way to approach it would be to give them, just for the sake of argument, that even though if everything about neo-Darwinism is true, does it undermine God?
Yeah.
And once we have that off the table, then we present our arguments for why Islam is the truth. Is that accurate?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct, Ismail. And you can sometimes do it the other way around. You can sometimes say, fine, have your Darwinism. What do you think about these prophecies? What do you think about this book? What do you think? You can sometimes go straight to showing why Islam is true. But there is a missing link here, yeah? And I think this is important. Okay, so Ismail, you have two friends. One friend they both say non-practicing. They're non-practicing. One friend, he just comes and meets you, and he is actually dressed and ready, and that night he's going to go party in a club, right? But just on the way he meets you. And then you have another friend who just is coming to meet you and they just came from their mom's funeral, right? Now, if you say to both of these people who are not practicing, you say to one about, and independently, you talk about, brother, life is, it's not just about this. We should also think about the hereafter and, this type of stuff. And you say the same thing to the other, which one are you going to have a huge impact on, and which one is it going to go over their head?
Yeah, you're right. It's about context, basically. It's like you have to assess who's approaching you and like what would be the source of knowledge or the approach, I guess, that works with them.
I was actually going to make the opposite point. The point I was going to make is,
Oh, okay.
right, you sometimes look at the context that this guy is clearly not ready, this guy's ready. But what you're supposed to do as a da'iyah is get them both on the same playing field, talk to them, talk to this guy about the fact that life is short. Get him in the right psychological mindset. This guy, he's already primed. Why this is important is because you're going to notice the people who are practicing at university and even the people who convert to Islam, they think about death, they think about purposes of life, or they've been through tests and trials in their life, or they've had someone who passed away, or they have existential anxiety. And these things are important. It's not just about giving someone logical arguments. It's also about first doing what the Quran does, which is getting them to think about their life, getting them to think about the fact that this life is short, getting them to reflect about these things that they don't want to reflect about. The thing about death is, and I think this was the main factor for me. When I first started practicing, when I was at university in my second year of university, the main cause of me starting to pray and me starting to learn the Quran and me starting to learn Aqidah and me starting to take Islam seriously was because my father passed away, right? And that hit me hard, right? And I think you don't have to have someone passing away for you to have that realization. And so in the dawah, like you said, we always take it back to God, whatever it is, Darwinism, whatever, how does it undermine God? However, we still need to get them psychologically ready to think about these things, because why do people sin? And we should think about this. Why do people sin, whether it's Muslims or non-Muslims? Is one of the reasons is complacency, because they think they're going to live forever. They think no one's watching and this type of thing. But once people start to understand the shortness of life, the fragility of life, the significance of life, automatically they start correcting themselves. Which is why, alhamdulillah, in the field of dawah, which I've been involved in, Allah's blessed me to be involved in for pretty much 11 years now. I have seen the people who are coming to Islam, it's not just they got a logical argument. These things were very important and they were thinking about them, and these facilitated. So they were facilitated by the logic. They were not preceded by the logic. Yeah. So this is also a very important point to always keep in mind, inshallah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Actually, I share a lot of your experience because I actually started practicing and taking Islam seriously in second year as well. And it was because, or what kind of put things into perspective was my mom being ill. So it's actually very similar there. And then also my best friend, around the similar time, me and him started discussing Islam, because this is when I was like really getting into it as well. And alhamdulillah, he's now a convert, or a revert, I should say. But it's funny you say that the logic wasn't what preceded. We would just talk about death, and we talk about, the big existential questions and stuff like that. So I appreciate all what you said. Just a little tangent side note before I finish. Is there any debates that maybe in the works for you and Brother Hijab with like William Lane Craig or anybody else you could tease us about?
So I'm sort of moving away from the debate scene. I'm trying to, and I'm spending a lot more of my time on the Uyghur issue. I think that for me is like, that's where I want to head off, right? Debates maybe, I may do them in the future. I probably will, but not, like a few years ago, it was like a focus, fine. The other thing, Ismail, is that it's very difficult to get opponents. Because not everybody, I mean, how many atheists are there out there who are willing to share a platform and have a debate? Definitely want to set up something with Muhammad Hijab and Matt Dilhunty or someone big like that in the future. inshallah. I think hijab's going to be around for a long time. He'll debate anybody. I mean, look, I'm not
I
even
know both
kidding.
of you.
Yeah, he will literally. You're walking down the road, someone will argue with him. He'll debate them there and then on the
Yep.
spot. That's what he does. Yeah. But I want to move to the Uyghur issue because for most of the last 10 years, I've just focused on the Dawah issue. But this is something I'm really passionate about. And maybe the MSA here, if you can set up a talk about the Uyghurs, then I can get Arsalan Hidayat, who is from Talk to East Turkestan. He's been on BBC, Al Jazeera. He's all over the internet. He is the #1 Uyghur activist in the English-speaking language on social media. I can get him down and we could do a talk together about China and the Uyghurs, what your university can do. Because look, I can give a talk which can reach 1,000 people about the Uyghurs and East Turkestan. But if I could do that at a university with 30 people, it's far better than 10,000 people watching it online, because the real movers and shakers and the people who can have an impact are university students, because they're the ones who do activism. They're the ones who are actually on campus to do activism, and there's plenty of things that can be done. So I'd be very grateful if you guys can set that up as well, inshallah.
Yeah, we actually have a talk about the Uyghur issue tomorrow, actually. Like the MSA set one up. And yeah, we have like 2 MPs and another brother who's an activist. But yeah, inshallah, if we have another one in the future, like this semester, I'm going to get into contact with you about that for sure. We can get Brother Aslan on that.
Brilliant, inshallah.
So we have okay, this is going to be our last question, inshallah, because Maghrib just came in Ontario, Canada. So Brother Arib is asking, so first he's thanking you for joining us today, and he says, as an experienced da'i, what areas do you think the Muslim community needs to work on in the field of da'wah?
Very good question. Very, very good question. I would say what we need to do as Muslims, you see, when it comes to business, we think in a very intelligent way, right? So when it comes to business, it's like, okay, what is trendy? What do I sell on Amazon? When it comes to social media, we're always in line with the latest trends, like, okay, so this person or whatever. When it comes to dawah, we sometimes work in silos. We sometimes get a book. Okay, what should I talk about? What's an important thing? Let's look at the trend here, guys, right? Let's look at the last 10, 15 years. You had a new atheist movement which took off, talking about atheism, liberalism, feminism, and all that stuff. That didn't really do that well, right? It still is huge, but didn't do that well. Then you had the likes of people like Jordan Peterson, who came along and they completely stole a large part of this audience. Why? Because they were talking about existentialism. They were talking about the meaning of life, the purpose of life. How do you deal with suffering? How do you deal with pain? How do you deal with anxiety of just being a human being? And these existential questions are something which are very much neglected. I truly believe as Muslims, we have to focus on existentialism, depression, social media addiction, which is linked to these things, materialism. All of these things are linked. And studying the Quran is obviously one of the main ways, if the main way, of understanding how to deal with these issues, but also academically looking at the works of existentialists and seeing how we can use this as a conduit to bring people to Islam. Many people, Muslims, non-Muslims, atheists, even the most hardcore atheists, they're glued to Jordan Peterson. Why? Because he's talking about this topic. I was watching a video of him today, and I'm not a fan. I like what he does, but I'm not like a categorical fan. But there's a lot of very good stuff he does. And he's talking about why he focuses on the Bible and the biblical lessons. And, he's basically saying, what else is there? And he's trying to explain it. And I was thinking, Allahu Akbar, man. We've got the Quran. We've got stories of the prophets, which doesn't show the prophets to be evil, which doesn't show the prophets to be fornicators, which corrects the Bible. And we've got deep stories from the sleepers of the cave, or Musa and Khidr, or all these different parables. So imagine if there was Muslims using the Quran and using the Sunnah and using the existential lessons from there and using this as a way of bringing people to Islam. That for me would be the way that we need to go.